Hello and welcome once again to the Fair Game podcast, We Love You Football. I'm Graham Miller, and in today's episode, we're looking at the challenging finances of modern football as we steam into 2026. It may be the world's most popular sport, but behind the passion, the noise and attention lies a financial system that's creaking under its own weight. From spiralling wages to reckless owners and the widening gulf between rich and poor clubs, today's football is facing a sustainability crisis. It's something we've been talking about regularly on the podcast, but more importantly, one that the game can no longer ignore. A new book by my fellow Fair Game ambassador Adrian Goldberg shines a light on these issues, asking whether football can indeed survive in its current form, and what must change to protect its future. And I'm delighted to say Adrian's with me now, alongside Fair Game CEO Niall Cooper. But as usual, before we start our conversation, Niall's here with all the latest news.
So obviously there's a lot of news going on at the moment, but the big thing for us is the Fair Game Conference. It's coming up very fast, 24th to 25th of March at the National Football Museum in Manchester. Loads of great things happening. We have brilliant speakers. Obviously, Adrian Goldberg, who's on the podcast later on, is joining us for one of the sessions. But we also have Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham as our keynote speakers. We have 3 groundbreaking reports. We'll be looking at the owners. How fit are they? We have the exclusive details that we'll be revealing at the conference. We'll be looking at the social impact of football. Does it really make a difference? We'll also be looking at the financial distribution. Can we make a real difference with the new regulator? And that's the kind of topic of most of today's podcast. So the major thing is, if you care about football, if you really want to make a difference to the game, then come along to the conference. We hope to see you there. Just log on to the website, www.fairgameuk.org. You'll find all the details there on the homepage. So come along to the conference. It'll be great for you to be there. Great to take part. Together, we can make a fairer future for the game we all love.
Well, Adrian, let's get straight down to the nitty-gritty. How do you see it? Can the game survive financially? What's your prognosis?
Well, I think football can survive. I started writing about football in the mid-1980s and I created a fanzine called Off the Ball. And I was concerned then at a time of rampant match day violence with the people I called the hooligans in the boardroom, people like David Bulstrode, who was trying to merge Fulham and Queen's Park Rangers, Robert Maxwell, who was trying to somehow force Oxford and Reading together under the banner of the Thames Valley Royals. So I've always had an eye out for the rogues and chancers in the football boardroom. And one of the ironies now is that football has never been wealthier. And that was one of the things I wanted to explore in the book, really, is that how is it that football is richer than it's ever been, yet feels more financially unstable than it has ever been? And of course, those two things really go together because we have this incredibly unequal distribution of money in the game. I am fundamentally optimistic about football, partly because I'm fundamentally optimistic as a human being and partly because I remember 40 years ago, and I remember the Football League at the time talking about having a policy of, quote, natural wastage. And this was the idea that if clubs hit hard times, if they went bust, they would simply be allowed to go out of business and then not be replaced within the Football League hierarchy. So we've weathered that storm. We've weathered the storms of the Bulstrodes and the Maxwells in the 80s. I think this modern era sets a particular set of challenges specific to our time. And I think football administrators have got to be on top of it. They've got to be mindful of it. And I do think we need all as fans to be working towards a kind of fairer, more sustainable game, because it isn't fair and it isn't sustainable at the minute.
We've papered over the cracks then to get this far, but are the cracks just getting bigger and bigger?
Well, I think the financial inequality is getting bigger and bigger, and I think that's one of the issues I think that the regulator in English football has to grapple with. If you look at the wealth of clubs in the top division, in the Premier League, I mean, the gap between the Premier League and the rest is massive, isn't it? But that's then been fueled by the arrival of Abramovich, a real key moment for the development of English football in 2003 at Chelsea. Then the arrival of the oil states, Abu Dhabi stroke United Arab Emirates at Manchester City, and Saudi Arabia at Newcastle United. Clubs who, even if they are constrained, in the case of Newcastle, from spending as much money as they want by the current rules, the spending rules, there is still no jeopardy for them in spending. I'm not saying there should be jeopardy in spending money, by the way, but they don't operate effectively under the same rules as the owners of my club, West Bromwich Albion, your club, Luton Town, and so on. And I think the inequality is built into the game. It's not, as the saying goes, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And you look at, for example, parachute payments, which are an attempt by the Premier League to build in a certain level of quality within its product. And you think, okay, fair enough. Why wouldn't you do that? Parachute payments give a kind of insurance policy to Premier League clubs, even less wealthy clubs. They know that they can spend, perhaps sometimes recklessly, because they have this insurance policy. And the insurance policy is that you go down to the Championship and for the next 3 years, you'll be looked after financially by the Premier League. But that in turn then distorts competition in the Championship. And there are usually at least 3 clubs, often it's 4 or 5, depending on who's gone up, who are benefiting from parachute payments. They have a massive, disproportionate financial advantage over the rest of the clubs in the Championship. And that means that so-called ambitious owners in the Championship are then encouraged to spend money that they don't have, or that the clubs don't have, in pursuit of that much coveted Premier League place. It draws up the wage bills for every club, and it encourages clubs to live unsustainably.
Niall, from my point of view, that's a very worrying summing up by Adrian. You're closer to the politics of it all. Are we making progress to secure the future of the game?
There's an option now. There wasn't there before, and it is the independent regulator. So one of the big things that's come through from the Football Governance Act was the link towards the financial distribution deal and the State of the Game report. Now, the State of the Game report is supposed to be the Bible, almost, of how football's financial health is. So it's supposed to look at all the different elements, including parachute payments, and come up with a list of recommendations. Now, the thing that we lobbied for and were successful in getting was making sure that any financial distribution proposal has to address the recommendations of the State of the Game report. Now, it takes no genius to work out what the problems are in football's finances, and Adrian's hinted at some of them through the parachute payments, and also the distribution, how it works at the moment between the various divisions. If those come up as a clear problem through the State of the Game report, and it'd be a massive surprise if they don't, then you'll be left in a situation where the next financial distribution deal will, through the legislation that's passed, have to address those concerns. So there should definitely be some element of hope. It's about how you actually build in an actual model that is effective and works well. And that's one of the things that Fair Game is working at right now, and been doing a lot of work and been a lot of research into that with a load of the leading academics and experts to try and get a model that's actually effective, because quite clearly it is financial recklessness that Adrian talks about that is prevalent at the moment throughout the game, and we need to look at doing that. It does absolutely nothing for clubs like West Brom in the Championship and all those clubs that are having to try and compete with those clubs who have parachute payments, because it's not sustainable. And the knock-on effect is that's also happening between the Championship and League One, which is another massive gap. And the other gap that people often perhaps don't talk about is between League Two and the National League, where you're just seeing reckless behaviour happening throughout the entire football pyramid. And those are the clubs that are likely to go bust or go into administration further down the pyramid. So there is hope, but it depends on the regulator really being brave and the State of the Game report coming out with firm recommendations. So I'm not quite the optimistic that Adrian is, but I can see a light at the end of this tunnel.
But we just can't carry on as we are. We do have to make changes.
I think that's an absolute definite. If you look at the stresses and strains on clubs that are trying to exist sustainably, they really can't. We live in a football environment where gambling culture is the key. You basically need to have owners that are willing to overspend and lose money. the classic argument is always, if you want to make a bit of money out of football, start with having a lot of money. That's the way to do it. You're going to lose cash unless the ecosystem changes, and it can do through a properly reorganised distribution model. And we need to be brave to do that, because at the moment, certainly my club, AFC Wimbledon, and fan-owned clubs, it's a route to ruin at the moment, because the finances just aren't there to be able to properly compete, and the regulation isn't there to give that security and encourage clubs to be fan-owned. That model is under threat.
Adrian, I do read, I do see, I do hear that the financial rules, they are changing. We've got, it needs to go before a vote, but I understand the so-called salary cost management protocol may well be coming into force next season, I should say. Who understands that? But will it make a change?
Well, I was chatting to a director of Lincoln City recently on a podcast I do called Where's the Money Gone? And they were saying that no fan stands on the terraces and shouts, "We've got the best cost controls in the league." I mean, it's not a meaningful thing for a fan to say, but I think it is something that all fans should be concerned about. And I think over time, even the EFL, and of course, bearing in mind that the EFL is effectively governed by the owners of football clubs, who themselves sometimes want to encourage reckless behaviour because it means they can spend money and achieve their, quotes, ambitions for their club. I think even the EFL has started to recognise that actually this is not a sustainable way forward. And I think the new financial regulations will make it harder to overspend, but it always amazes me that whenever these cost controls are introduced, there always seem to be amazing loopholes. So that, for example, when Birmingham City were relegated from the Championship, and they've got extremely wealthy US owners, they were able to lend money to the club, then convert those loans into equity, into shares in the club, and thereby quite legally get around the spending cap rules. And it's like, well, either you're going to have spending rules or you aren't. And I know, again, those rules are going to be tightened or have been tightened, but there's an appetite, I always think, within football club owners to get around whatever financial rules are in place. But I think it will make it harder to overspend. I think there's evidence that the EFL now, because the regulator is in place, are making greater efforts to ensure some kind of financial continence amongst clubs. I've been told, for example, that if you want to take over an EFL club, I was speaking to somebody who deals with football club buyouts a few days ago, and they said that now, if, for example, Club A loses on average £10 million a season, they will say, on top of the buying price for the club, you will have to show evidence that you can cover losses to that amount for 2 consecutive seasons. So I think belatedly the EFL is getting its act into order, but yeah, it's taken a long time. And I say, I'm sure there's always owners who are looking for loopholes and get-outs.
You say it'll make it harder for clubs to spend, but will that make it fairer in general?
Well, I mean, one of the difficulties, I think, with football is that there are bigger clubs and there are smaller clubs. And as soon as you go to any kind of system which says clubs can only spend a percentage of what they earn through gate income, through sponsorship and so on, then the clubs which have bigger support are going to have a bigger budget than clubs who have a smaller level of support or who exist in smaller, poorer towns. But yeah, I wouldn't suggest personally that we should strive for absolute equality within football. I think there's got to be a bit of a rough and a smooth with it. But certainly at the top level of the game, you look at the Premier League, where the honours are pretty much always divvied up between 3 or 4 clubs, and where in my lifetime in the top division of English football, you could imagine clubs like Watford, Ipswich Town, my club West Brom, actually competing for the league title, things that now would be inconceivable if clubs like that were able to compete for the title. Would that make the Premier League a more attractive proposition? In my view, it would, but that's a battle that's to be fought.
Now, the vote is yet to come. Is it a slam dunk? Will it go through, or will those clubs say, no, we don't want this?
I think it's it's on a knife edge about how it will work, because there are reckless owners that don't want it. And there'll be also the other thing with squad cost ratios is if you're a ambitious club at the lower half of that, of the Premier League, then the revenue you have is so significantly less than the revenues at the top end that means that the amount you can spend on players' wages is actually so significantly lower. So you can't effectively gamble to become one of those clubs at the top end. And that's all to do with how the distribution works in the Premier League itself. So I would be very surprised if you didn't see a number of the clubs at the lower end not supporting it. And that's where the difference is. The problem really exists is that the amount of money that splits between the game doesn't go in any kind of equitable way. And that's where you are looking at financial distribution. Now, a lot of the research globally has always said that if you want a long-term sustainable product, you've got to maintain a reasonable level of competitive balance. And what we're beginning to see is that falling apart at several different levels. Certainly in the Championship, certainly at the top end of the Premier League, where you're just seeing these mini leagues, and that's where it is. So if you want to see, and I really love the idea of the likes of Watford and Ipswich and so on being able to be up there competing again, you need to also look at how the distribution works throughout those individual divisions, as well as between divisions. I sit on the executive board of the Union of European Clubs, and they do a lot of idea about how you make sure some more of that money from clubs that compete in Europe goes further down through those divisions, and that's one of those routes. So there are a number of different things that I think need to be applied, and we need to look beyond just squad cost ratios, which are sensible about trying to make sure a club doesn't go bust. They do not address the other concern of the regulator, which is competitive balance. And in fact, there is a fair argument to say they actually increase the problem with competitive balance.
But it's all on a knife edge. We won't know for a while yet.
Yeah, I think so. And the issue with it in my mind is that there's actually a bigger overhaul that needs to happen rather than squad cost ratios. I think squad cost ratios is part of a bigger jigsaw. I think it does need to come into play. There's an interesting concept about anchoring. So anchoring is where the clubs at the top end can only spend a certain amount of times of what the club at the bottom spends. And that sort of thing is where you would get on players' wages, where you would get a kind of bit of a more of a balance. It's worthwhile exploring that. I think the other thing is looking at the whole idea of reward payments and ring-fence payments within a distribution model. A reward payment is basically the clubs that are financially sustainable getting more money. The club's ring-fence funding should be towards clubs that looking at long-term infrastructure developments that make clubs more financially sustainable. We need to think beyond players' wages, and we need to think beyond what makes just the success on the pitch. We need to think about what makes a club there for its fans, there for its community, and stronger long-term. The model at the moment in football is often, particularly lower down the league, you spend lots of money on the ambition to get promoted, and then you sell the club because a club in a higher division is worth significantly more. That's where you've got your gambling going on. That boosts players' wages throughout the entire pyramid. Until you change how that operates, we're left going around in a spiral of widening gaps across everywhere.
Adrian, looking beyond players' wages, it seems to me that the rules are almost, the financial rules are almost against fair play. I was hearing Crystal Palace, for example, they've been blocked by the FA from giving Macclesfield their cup tie ticket money after that remarkable win in the FA Cup. It's almost like they're cutting their nose to spite the face. I mean, those are the rules, but it doesn't make any sense.
I'm not sure about that, actually, on that particular case. I kind of understand the setting of the precedent, and Macclesfield will have done very well financially out of it. Personally, I'm not a fan of little clubs kind of begging for more money from big clubs. I think the system should be there in place, and I do think if a club like Macclesfield gets a very good FA Cup run, they are financially rewarded for doing so, as is right and proper. So I wouldn't point at that as a particular issue personally, but I was interested that the conversation earlier talking about how whether we have to change football because it's not financially sustainable. I think another way of looking at it is to say, do we want to change football what kind of football culture do we as supporters want? Do we just want things to carry on as they always have done in this kind of very rough and tumble free market way? Or do we want to think of a way that we could run football differently? Not because we have to, but because it might be better. It might be better for us as fans, and it might be better for sporting balance. And that's kind of where I'd like to shift the conversation, really, and say, do we just want to have a different football culture than the one where we as fans see our clubs fall over sometimes, get rescued by whoever, because we know that historically the checks on who an owner and director might be have not been particularly rigorous, and then have that person inject hundreds of millions of pounds or tens of millions of pounds into our club in pursuit of success, which if they're unsuccessful, the club falls over and we then start again, that kind of whole sugar rush of money coming into football. Do we want football to be something different? I'm not talking about a model in which footballers don't earn lots of money. I'm not talking about a model in which sponsorship and commerce doesn't have a role in football. But the most obvious example I would point to as a point of comparison with English football is German football, where pretty much every club is 50 plus 1% owned by the fans. And I do think if you go and watch German football, as I have done, and which I find increasingly attractive, there is a very different culture, a very different feel on the terraces and in the stands, and there's a kind of horrible impatience about English football, and that's crept in, that's grown, I think, over recent years because the game has become so money orientated, and I think it's been to the detriment of the sport, to the enjoyment of the sport by supporters, so that we're all obsessed with the latest transfer, we're all obsessed with where we finish in the league because that will generate more money for the club. It's kind of taken the focus away, in my view, from the sport and the community outside the stadium, but especially the community in the stadium, where the idea of just going to the football and having a good time, hoping your team wins, but it not being a matter of life and death, that little bit seems to me to have disappeared from English football to its detriment.
I will pick up on that conversation. I just want to come back to the FA Cup for a moment or two, because it has been the lifesaver for so many small clubs. Because the other side of the Macclesfield story, Exeter, for example, they played out in a near sold-out Etihad Stadium. They got slaughtered, of course, but they only managed to bank £180,000 because City really had very low-priced tickets.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back on you on this, Graham. If Exeter City in their past and if Macclesfield now are relying on the absolute roll of the dice of a cup run...
But it's a bonus, isn't it? It's not a reliance.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? So if it's a nice bit of cream on the top of your sundae, brilliant, fantastic. It should not be the get-out-of-jail card that some clubs seem to think it is. That, to me, if you're a club that says we need a good cup run in order to survive, and I think in the past that was pretty much the case with Exeter City, that's evidence that your club is poorly run. So I think that I'd look at the owners of smaller clubs. These are still professional clubs. They're still clubs that carry the names of the towns or the communities which they represent. If you're having to go cap in hand to a Premier League club, or if you're reliant on a good cup run and the TV money that it brings to keep you in business, change your business model.
I've got to come in here a lot here. I think where we're at is this is the opportunity to look at where that distribution model could change and could help here. The distribution model is worth £3.2 billion a year. Parachute payments coming at around 300 million. Now, one of the things that the EFL requires clubs to have is something like 13 different roles, 13 different staff. That's what's an EFL requirement. So actually just for clubs to operate, they need £500,000. Then you look at stadium maintenance. Stadium maintenance itself, probably for an average club, is probably about £300,000-400,000 in the EFL. Now, if you were to look at the parachute payments and you were to reduce it, and we've done the academic research, not to get rid of it, but just reduce it, that reduction, which is down to, the suggestion is 25% of equal share, and currently it's 55%, there's a whole complication about how that works. That reduction would be enough to provide what we would say as core funding for every single club from the Premier League down to National League North and South. That gives you enough money to make sure you have people in the ground to turn the lights on, and making sure your lights actually work. That is just by basically halving parachute payments. That's not a massive change, and that is enough to secure all of those clubs and make sure they're not dependent on a cup run. It doesn't affect the Premier League. And then people go, oh, what about those clubs who get relegated? The academic research shows that they would still be fine with half of that. And we're only ever talking about 3 clubs. That reduction actually provides that safety net for every single club down to National League North and South. That's something like 164 clubs. That's what you're talking about. That's just one example about how the current financial distribution deal doesn't work. Because I'm with Adrian in the sense that, in a way, I'm lucky because I do support a fan-owned club, and that I go to a ground and I'm, an owner, I get cross. I do see the system not particularly working, but I also feel a real pride about the fact I actually have a club. And it's my club, and I'm not at the whim of someone else. If you've got that security net, so your club is going to be in existence, that's where you start seeing a change. There are other different bits that we would look at on that financial distribution deal. So I'm not even talked about the amount the Premier League has compared to the Championship and all the rest of it. There definitely needs for change there. But just that one change makes sure a huge fundamental difference. There's so much options and opportunities here. We shouldn't be having to be a Macclesfield or an Exeter City relying on that just to exist, when the money is there to make sure you can just exist.
One thing that does upset the apple cart, and Adrian's hinted at it, is that word emotion, the feeling of emotion. I'm thinking of a particular chairman, what was it, Peter Ridsdale, wasn't it, living the dream at Leeds, and he nearly killed the club. I mean, what you've said, it makes perfect sense, and nobody could disagree with it. But when a chairman gets it into his head that if he spends, he can just keep at the top and keep getting the money, all of that goes out the window.
So this is where you look at the key people in football clubs. They're often the chief financial officer. So if you make it financially beneficial to be sustainable, then actually clubs will start being financially sustainable. Sounds crazy. So again, going back to that distribution model, one of the big things that we look at is take around 40% of that 3.2 billion and say you're only allowed to get it if you are financially sustainable. So if you do spend within that level of 70% of your revenue on players' wages, then you would get extra cash. If you are technically solvent, and remember, only 35% of clubs in the top 4 divisions are technically solvent, then you get more cash. If you're a CFO and you start seeing, well, actually, how do I get more money from that distribution deal? And the answer is by being more financially sustainable, you will see an incentive to be more financially sustainable. And remember the culture that we have at the moment where the Deloitte money table is seen as something that like fans go, oh, fantastic, my club is 17th in the Deloitte money table. What weird world are we in when that's seen as some big thing? Whereas actually, if you start changing the culture within a club to saying, look, we're financially sustainable, then I can guarantee that over time, you'll have clubs going, look, we're financially sustainable. We've got all this extra money because we were sensible. That's how you start changing the culture, because it is flawed. And when you look at that Germany model, it's because those fans are sitting there going, well, I'm proud of my club. I own this club. We're not going to be reckless. We're here to be financially sustainable. That doesn't exist in Britain because all of the mechanisms are encouraging clubs to overspend, be reckless, try and compete, live the Leeds United dream. And the reality is only a couple of clubs are ever going to achieve that dream. And there are a whole load of people hitting the hurdles, falling down, going to administration, going through turmoil. And all of that, that's people's jobs. That's livelihoods. That's community infrastructures. That's not needed when you could just have going to a ground, watching your club, being with your mates, enjoying the experience. And if you're a Wimbledon fan, maybe we might score a goal in the next week or two, because we haven't done that for 6 home games. So,
well, one of the difficulties, I think, Niall, with what you're talking about is that if you are a fan-owned club, and I'm doing some research for my next book into fan-owned clubs, is just how difficult it is to compete with clubs who are spending beyond their means. Now, of course, if they've got a wealthy benefactor, it is, I suppose you could argue, not beyond their means, because the means are that they'll get bailed out by the wealthy benefactor. But fan-owned clubs almost always have to only spend what they receive in. So against a club who's got an owner willing to dip their hand in the pocket and spend 2, 3, 10, 15 million pounds over and above their income, you've clearly got a disproportionate fight there, haven't you? You've got somebody fighting, as it were, with one arm tied behind their back. And, you know, it would make for a very interesting league if everybody just had to break even, if that was the rule. But then at the top end of the game, as I say, you've got this additional layer now, haven't you, where, and, you know, I go into this in some detail in the book, the way in which political pressure has been leveraged. Unquestionably, political pressure was leveraged in order to allow what is effectively the Saudi Arabian state to take over Newcastle United, their public investment fund. And the PIF sent a guarantee that Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler, would not be involved in the running of Newcastle United. Well, you know, he's the ruler of a state. He's not going to be getting involved in who the next midfielder for Newcastle United is, but the PIF is overtly an arm of the Saudi state, of which MBS is the chair. And other senior figures at Newcastle United are involved in the public investment fund. So even if we say, well, you know, clubs should only spend what they have, if what they have is the backing of an oil state, and this is also true of Manchester City and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where again there's a different kind of political pressure leverage there, with property deals in the centre of Manchester involving the UAE, with calls by the UAE to force the British government to outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation. That hasn't happened, by the way, I should stress, but clear pressure was put.
It could happen.
Indeed, it could happen. Hasn't happened yet, because the Muslim Brotherhood say they are not a terrorist organisation and they are allowed to operate in many countries around the world. But football gets caught up in these big geopolitical questions. And I know that the people at Newcastle who run the NUFC Fans Against Sports Washing, who feel that their club has been used as a vehicle by the Saudi state to promote its brand, feel very strongly that not only should the Saudi state not be involved in running their club, but that no state should be involved in the running of a football club. It's not appropriate. But over time, and I believe to the detriment of our game, states have become involved in the running of our football clubs.
You've called your book, Where's the Money Gone? Where's it gone?
Somebody said to me, my mate Ash Gould, who was a broadcaster on Talk Sports, he came to my launch and he said, Goldie, I'll tell you where it's gone. It's gone to the players and it's gone to the agents. There you go, 2 sentences. I don't know why you waited all that time writing a book. And I had to confess he was right. So there is an element, and clearly a lot of money does go to players, which in my view is only right and proper. And a fair bit of it goes to agents. But this is more about the processes by which money has been leveraged to wield political and other influence in our national life and in our national sport.
Niall, you've discussed stronger regulation, fairer revenue distribution and so on, more responsible ownership. We have the regulator in place now. Is he the knight in shining armour that's going to bring to fruition everything that you've been dreaming about, working hard over?
Oh, gosh, a great question. I feel like I need to go shopping in an armour shop and deliver it. I'm not sure. We've had conversations with the regulator quite regularly. Their consultation documents they've put forward at the moment weren't strong enough, in my opinion, and there's definitely room for improvement. The area that we're keen to do is to get the arguments really strong and really robust and present them and get backing of wider people within football to say these things need to change. So we talk about escrow accounts, so the idea of clubs having accounts where all the money for the next year of liabilities is set aside. So if an owner walks away, the club can still exist. Those sort of things. And that could, again, be partially funded by a distribution deal, because that's also where, fans want to know not only do the lights work and the staff are there, but actually if the owner disappears, that club can still be there. At the moment, the big problem that you have with a rich owner, if the rich owner walks away, more often than not, you're left with a club that was technically insolvent, that doesn't have the revenue to cover the wages, that's what a club's left with, which is basically instant bankruptcy, fire sales, all the rest of it. That's the issue you've got with really rich owners. So yes, the likes of AFC Wimbledon and Exeter might be spending within their means because they have to with their model. The benefit of that is they're spending within their model, right? So they are going more likely to be there, but they can't compete. Whereas the clubs who are overspending, when it goes wrong, it will go very badly wrong. So that's the issue that we've got now. And I think that's the bit that we need to talk about. Is this regulator going to be the knight in shining armour? The reality is, a bit like wait and see, but there is an opportunity that hasn't been there before, and that's the difference. So what we need is that regulator, that knight in shining armour, to get on his white horse, have that sword, and gallop forward and actually try and be brave and do things the right way. Because at the moment, I'm feeling they've not even got the armour on yet.
Nor the horse warmed up. Adrian, you've spoken about speaking to people who are involved in buying football clubs. Do you get the impression now that it's quite an attraction? There are more people wanting to buy English football clubs?
Well, I think there are two kind of push and pull factors there, aren't there? The thing that makes English football clubs attractive, particularly at the moment to Americans, is that the United States is a country with a lot of wealthy people, a lot of millionaires, but the franchise system makes owning an American sports club way beyond the reach of your average millionaire, if there can be such a thing. And people might then look from the States at EFL clubs in particular, and they might see a Walsall, who are American-owned, or a Carlisle United in the National League, who are US-owned, and think that for a relatively small amount of money, relatively small for a millionaire, they can actually do something that makes a difference and grow their investment. So I think there's strong evidence of an interest there. I do think if the regulator is robust, though, that might scare off a few potential owners. And I think that's one of the things that owners of both EFL and Premier League clubs are wary of, because obviously if you come to the point where you want to sell your football club, you want to be able to market it to as wide a group of millionaires and billionaires as possible. But if a regulator is really going to be robust about its owners and directors test, about how much money you've got to have available and maybe put up in escrow to ensure the future of the club, that might scare a few people off. Although, in my view, it will only be scaring the wrong people off, the people who either can't afford it or who you might suspect will be doing strange things with the money that they generate through a football club.
Is there a worry that those American millionaires will want to change the whole setup because they're, in terms of their growth, they don't want relegation because they can't then make their financial plans?
I think we have to be careful of judging them as a group. I mean, they are from the United States and there are certain cultural norms, I suppose, in the States in terms of professional sport, and I understand the concern. I mean, certainly in terms of the growth of the development of the Super League, English clubs with US owners were at the forefront of that. But I think if people are buying Carlisle United, if they're buying West Bromwich Albion, if they're buying Walsall, they're not expecting to have sealed leagues, and I think they're buying for other reasons than that. But in any event, I think one of the missions of the regulator is to ensure that there isn't any kind of fundamental change in the way that the game is run without the permission, as it were, of supporters. But you can never be sure. And clearly, if you've got a lot of extremely powerful vested interests at the top of football, you have to keep a very close eye on them, whether they're from the States or wherever. And, you know, it wouldn't amaze me if there's an attempt to create a Super League at some point again in the future. On the other hand, the way that the Champions League has now been developed in the Europa League, it's kind of, we've sort of got a Super League by stealth. We've got a Super League through the back door in any case.
The other areas you refer to, are they going to be good for football?
The other areas,
you said they might, when they bring in their money, they bring their ideas to own a club. They might have other ideas than simply just relegation.
Oh yeah, well I think the owner, again, I give those examples: the owners of Walsall, the owners of Carlisle United, the owners of West Bromwich Albion, in my club. Although we're not doing very well at the moment, but I think on the whole, those US owners seem to be well motivated, but they see themselves generally as custodians of a club, and I think they regard it as a bit of a quirky venture. But again, we have to be careful of us kind of making kind of blanket statements about people whose only thing in common is that they're very rich and they're from the States. Although there was a great story from Sheelan Patel, West Brom's owner, on a podcast that I listened to a few months ago, where he said that if he's at a dinner party back home in Miami and somebody comes up to him and says, "What do you do?" If he just says, "Oh, I'm a software millionaire," "Oh, okay, well done." If he says, on the other hand, "I'm the owner of an English football club," people's eyes light up and it's exciting. So I think there are quite a lot of American owners who are just in it for the fun of it.
Can I just come in on that? The problem slightly with that is the boredom threshold and the point where they start losing money. And what we forget in all of this is the average supporter. Who are the actual people who are the real custodians of a football club? And it's you, Adrian, at West Brom. It's you, Graham, at Luton. We're the people who actually hold the history and traditions of a club, not necessarily this owner who's come in and going, "My eyes are going to light up when I say I'm a owner of an English football club and a cocktail party in Miami."
But I think that's true though, with whoever the owner is. I wouldn't disagree with you. I would just say that's no different if you're an American owner, an owner from China, an owner from wherever that isn't rooted in your local community. But we live in a kind of globalized world. Do we say to those people, "You can't come in"?
This is the bit where you need to put around safeguards around those sort of people, and you need to make sure that the fans have a real proper voice, because otherwise, you just run roughshod. And we all have frustrations with our owners. I certainly, the reason why AFC Wimbledon exists is because we had a huge problem with our owners. That's the sort of thing that we need to look at, having this regulator come in and sort out. While I can imagine the image, I don't really want to be at the whims of a person who's got a twinkle in his eye because of a cocktail party he's having in Miami. That, for me, doesn't really fit in with my kind of idea about a fan, traditions and heritage and the rest of it. That kind of... I know it's true. That's the thing. I know it's true, and I can picture it being true, and I can picture that. But are we really just that glint in somebody's eye in a cocktail party, or are we actually decades of history and traditions and blood, sweat and tears and those cold nights on a February and the bleak floodlights as we scrape a 0-0 draw away at wherever? That's what the football for me is about. It's not about like a warm cocktail party or
but unless we change, and I have hinted at the German 50+1 model, unless we change the ownership model, which I'm very open to, then we live in a globalised world and global investors will have the chance to invest in football.
Niall and Adrian, thank you very much indeed for your time. If you've enjoyed it, do please subscribe to the Fair Game podcast. You can find it on all the usual channels. I'm Graham Miller. The producer is Ian Beach. Thank you for listening. And until the next edition of We Love You Football, it's goodbye for now.